many times do you hear, don't do that, you're going to get hurt, which instills this idea of fear. I feel like it starts very young. And then we have this culture of fear in the West. Everything is to be feared and dominated because we're afraid of it. So that leads us to this space of wanting to control everything, which then, to John's point, is kind of how a lot of companies get run, with this sort of top-down, I need to control because I'm so frightened of things that are not in my control.
Welcome to The Art of Quality, the podcast that explores the lived experience of guests who have a deep familiarity with quality in the domains of business, entrepreneurship, investing, and the arts. By sharing stories about how master practitioners experience their life's work, we hope to inspire others who are seeking to bring more quality into their lives. Today, we're speaking with Allison Paradise, founder of the Epicenter. At the Epicenter, Allison has built a space where young children are empowered to nurture their creative gifts in a judgment-free environment. Allison is one of the most intuitively gifted people I have ever known. We are deeply excited to have her on the show to explore the nature of this gift of intuition and how it relates to the experience of quality in children's lives and among adults in the domain of leadership. One of the most interesting aspects of our session with Allison was her perspective on how we can shift our behavior from conditioned, fear-based motivation to love-based motivation and the impact this can have on the quality of our lives. We hope you enjoy. Allison, it is our great pleasure to welcome you to an episode of the Quality Podcast. We are overjoyed to the prospect of this next hour or so with you. And I would love to begin by asking you, given how much time you have spent with children, how much time you spend with children today. So we, within this group, spend a lot of time trying to unlearn bad habits. And so I'd love for your perspective on what bad habits spending time with children has cured you of.
That's a fabulous question. First, let me say the pleasure is all mine. Thank you so much for having me. It's an honor to be here with you all. That's a great question. The first one that comes to mind is around wonder and awe. I feel like as we get older, we lose that sense of amazement at the world. And when you're around young kids, especially really young kids, kids under the age of 5, but even I would say under the age of 8, everything's new. And so they perceive and they see things that we as older people tend to overlook. And they see it with a sense of wonder. And that's really powerful to be around. And a great reminder, I feel like, for us as adults, that there is in every moment, in every visual field, something amazing to look at. I'm looking right now out of this window, and there's a pretty large spider. I think it's a garden spider that, I was going to say got trapped in the window, but I'm going to be honest. I trapped in the window because I thought, I don't really want that roaming around the house at night because it's quite large. And I wake up this morning and the sun is shining in and there's this glistening, beautiful web that's just sparkling with rainbows that I get to look at through a bouquet of flowers that's in front of me. So there's just this beautiful view. And I have to be honest, I feel like most people wouldn't even notice the web existed, let alone see the beauty in it. And I feel like every child would notice it immediately. So that's one thing. There's also a lot of excitement that young kids have at things that I feel like as adults, maybe if we feel it, maybe it's there, but we're really afraid to express it. There's something sort of inappropriate, I feel like we think about adults that get really excited. And that's just silly, really silly, because why not be excited and overjoyed when something is amazing and awesome? So I love being able to be around people who are so free with their emotional states, and then practicing that for myself as an adult. I often give this exercise to people to skip down the street, because I feel like that's such a great exercise as an adult, because people freak out when you say, well, why don't you just skip down the street? Someone might see me, someone might think something. But that level of just ability to have, you have to do it when you're actually excited, but to have that freedom to just go, I'm so excited, and to throw your hands up and do a little dance. I don't know, that feels really important. And it's something that we do unlearn or learn otherwise as we get older. And I would say the third thing, if I'm going to just pick on the top three, relates quite a bit to quality in my mind, which is around the care with which something is done. There's a sensitivity, I feel like, to the attention and the care that's put into something. And not necessarily, I feel like my parents would hear that and go, wait a minute, I do all sorts of things where I put a lot of care and attention into it. And my 3-year-old's like, whatever, and destroys it. I would say less in the material space and more in the sort of non-material space, that there's a real sensitivity to what's being given in terms of full attention, love, hugs, all of those sort of non-material things. There's quite a bit of sensitivity to. And as we get older, I notice that even older kids, 12, 13, 16 years old, they become uncomfortable with that level of attention and care, because they've started to learn that that's not kind of how we are as adults. We're more aloof. It's not cool to be that intentional and attentive. But for younger kids, they really know the difference. And that's kind of cool, because it means that we probably also know the difference as adults, even if we're not acknowledging it or have an awareness about it.
What's your sense of, or cultural aspect of, this conditioning that leads children to lose these aptitudes, whether it's all excitement, emotional openness, this loving, attentive care? Are there any observations that might cross some of these domains where you're like, okay, there's something in our culture that is conducive to losing touch with these essences?
Yeah, in Western culture, at least. That's really my experience, is mostly in Western culture. It starts with school. From my perspective, you can really watch it. Kids who are in kindergarten still maintain this, because kindergarten fosters a lot of these things. But as you get older, it's not encouraged to have a wide range of emotions. You're meant to sit in a chair for a really long period of time and absorb information, and then say that information back to someone. And the awe and wonder of things is stripped away when you're not allowed to observe for yourself, but you're told what is. So you start to see in older children, 8, 9, they're labeling everything with an I know, the label for all the things, as opposed to, oh my gosh, isn't that incredible? The facts, the sort of informational facts, become dominant over the quality feeling of the experience. So that's one part of it for sure. And then our whole society is oriented towards a very specific way of being, and that is to kind of fall in line with what somebody else tells you to do. And so it just doesn't work. If you're going to be obedient, to have a lot of these freer qualities. It makes you a very poor employee, which is something I used to say about myself the one time I was an employee. I was the worst. I'm a terrible employee. No one should ever meet. Because I somehow didn't lose a lot of these things. Some of them, yes, but a lot of them I retained. And I had just an impossible time being in that sort of really confined space. But we want really good employees. And so to make a good employee, you have to learn just to really squash a lot of these things and deny them in yourself. And then layered on top of that, so that's been going on in our culture for however long, hundreds of years. And then we've got layered on top of that now a lot of connectivity between the internet and social media and everything else that's virtual reality systems, like all of that on top of what's already been in the baseline just accelerates that loss because everything is now mimicked. So rather than this original kind of uniqueness getting at least nourished for longer, if I think back to my childhood, I feel like the uniqueness of what I did was valued up until I was maybe 12 by my peers. And then after that, there was sort of the like, oh, you don't fit into this clique or whatever. But up until then, it really wasn't a thing. Everybody was sort of, okay. That I see happening much, much earlier now. The judgment of other children happening 7 or so because of all the things that they're observing and absorbing from media that tells them, no, this is the way you're supposed to be. So if you've got that kind of programming happening really young, it sucks a lot of this out. The reassuring bit is that they're so young, it's easy to find it again. They haven't lost, it's not so far away that it can't come back when they're that young. But I do feel like that's a contributing factor.
And I pull on the thread you mentioned a minute ago. You made a terrible employee, and part of it was you tried or just hadn't fully lost a sense of wonder and curiosity and so forth. You also built a business. I mean, I know it was more than a business, but a business in a sense, a community, and led a group of people for a number of years. So I'm very curious, how did you, as somebody who self-admittedly is a poor employee, now you're leading many people. What did you do that might surprise us, as somebody who is a leader is still curious and full of wonder and so on? How did you manage to manifest that in a group and have a group that could, I'm assuming, all pull, row the same direction, but maybe still value wonder and silence and reflection and so forth?
The primary feeling of that team at My Green Lab was that everybody had something truly valuable to contribute, and I wasn't there to control anybody. So there was no sense of it being about me, first of all. I feel like that's really important. That was partially, I think, there was no sense about me, and everybody had ownership of what it was that was being created. So I felt like that was something that was missing for me when I was working for a big company. Either the people I worked for made it about them, or they made it about an organization that I didn't feel like it mattered one way or another what I did. The organization sort of existed as an entity unto itself. That I kind of have this image of that serpent that's eating its tail. It's just doing this, and we weren't doing that. The gesture, instead of a circular thing, the gesture was more of a exploding out sort of V gesture. So building from something small to something much larger, an upside down triangle, maybe. So that was the feeling of it. And when we would do the annual reviews, the only thing that I told people that I would ever sort of mark them down for was, one, if they didn't take all of their holiday, That was really important to me, that people take all their holiday. In the United States, there's this culture of let me never take any time off. And if they answered emails during their holiday, that also was a reason for me to mark them down, because people will say they're on holiday and then they'll respond to every email. That's not taking a break. And then I asked everybody to come up with 3 personal goals for themselves. And those were the things that we measured against. So actually they had nothing to do with the performance, quote unquote, of the company. It was all about, how do you outgrow yourself here? What is it that's really personal to you? And some of those might be related to work, but a lot of them had nothing to do with work. One of the women I worked with wanted to learn how to surf. So I would just, every time we talked, ask her, how's the surfing going? Because that level of care for a person is what then builds a really solid team that then makes us all want to work with and for each other. And it was amazing. It was an amazing culture to be a part of. And I'm so grateful for the people that I had an opportunity to work with, that they also appreciated building something or being part of something in that way. And yeah, when I work with a lot of companies now, I notice, because I work with children and I also do a lot of work with adults, and some companies that sometimes have me come in, and that sort of top-down culture, it just stifles all creativity in people. They're so afraid. They're afraid they're going to lose their job. They're afraid that somebody's not going to like what they have to say. There's just so much fear underlying everything, and you can't really be free in a space where you're afraid.
Thank you for that. With no goals directly related to what your organization was trying to do, I'll put this maybe a little bit bluntly on purpose. How were you successful? I mean, that sounds a little bit like let's all get together and support each other, but not necessarily with a focus on what the organization's trying to do. But I know the organization itself was successful. So can you say a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I think it was understood that when people were hired, it was always the first, let's say before people were hired, the first check was, are we aligned in the mission of what it is that we're trying to do here? Because without that, I don't want to have to be convincing somebody that what we're doing is valuable every day. That's exhausting. So if we're not aligned, then this just isn't going to work. And they had all sorts of ways of evaluating that. Here's a really good example, I feel. The first test I would give to people, and it was a test, was I would meet people at a coffee shop if I hadn't already met them before. And I would have a friend usually with me, which I know is unusual for a first meeting, but it was important for me to do this. And he would sit there with headphones on and he would code. So he couldn't hear anything that was happening. And he was very obviously engrossed in doing something else. And the table had only 2 chairs. And so when people would come in, it was a very busy coffee shop, I would always ask them to get a chair from another table. And I would watch how many people would ask to borrow a chair. It's a really simple thing. So many people would just grab a chair without asking the people at the table if they could borrow it. And then when they would sit, I would notice, who do they orient themselves to? Who are they talking to? Are they talking to me? Or are they talking to the person who's got headphones on? And then when they're done, when they put the chair back, same thing. How do you put the chair back? And I know this isn't necessarily about the company itself, but just those sort of little things initially of, okay, are you able to be in a group of people and be kind to the people that you know and the people that you don't know? Where is your attention put? And then after that, where is your heart on this mission? So questions around, how do you live your life? Do you embody the mission of sustainability? Because if you don't, it's fine, but it's just not gonna work. So everybody there, their hearts were already aligned with the mission. So I didn't really have to do much to convince people that they should be doing anything other than what their hearts were already asking to do. And when they would come up with new programs or new projects, we would just do them. So people were allowed to follow their excitement because it would always lead to really interesting things. Yeah, I just wasn't afraid. And I think that makes a big difference.
What's your sense in observing children in your life, in your professional life today, as to why we become afraid?
We're told that we should be afraid. It starts from the most basic things of someone's going to kidnap you. Right? Be afraid walking down the street. Be afraid that you're going to fall out of the trees that you climb. You're going to get hurt. How many times do you hear, don't do that, you're going to get hurt, which instills this idea of fear. I feel like it starts very young. And then we have this culture of fear in the West. Everything is to be feared and dominated because we're afraid of it. So that leads us to this space of wanting to control everything, which then, to John's point, is kind of how a lot of companies get run, with this sort of top-down, I need to control because I'm so frightened of things that are not in my control. And that just pulls all the way through from the very first, don't do that, you might get hurt. And I wonder how much of it's related to a fear of our own mortality that gets put on at a very young age. Because I feel like that's where it comes from with parents. It's not you might get a cut, it's you might die. And then those sorts of very existential fears get carried through. When I talk to older people about, say, oh, this path maybe doesn't feel like it's beneficial to you. What if you were to switch paths? It always spirals into, well, then I won't have enough money, then I'll be homeless, and then I'll die. It always ends with death somehow. Very hyperbolic. So my sense is that it stems from this very core fear of our own mortality. And it plays out in all these different ways in our culture. But what's your sense? Where do you feel like it comes from?
What you're saying resonates very deeply for me, and I would add that our culture really struggles to talk about death.
Mm-hmm.
And that's part of the problem, that we're wired in a way, and thank God we're worried about dying, or thank goodness, but without a cosmology that can, I feel like we lack a cosmology today that can make sense of death, that this materialist worldview that we exist in, this idea that the material world is primary. I guess that the hard problem of consciousness comes in here, of what comes first. Is it the material arising out of the field, or is it the other way round? But I feel like that the dominant paradigm today, this materialist worldview, really struggles to work with transience, to work with life coming and going, that we hold on so tight because we don't know what else to do.
I have a working theory that the invention of retirement, which was really post-World War II, was really when, at least in Western cultures, presumably elsewhere, but where we came up with this whole idea of you're going to work for a little while and then stop and presumably do nothing. And I have this working theory that was a real cancer for our species. Mm-hmm. And it's because, for the first time in our species, at least at scale, we sort of gave people this idea of if you can follow a certain path in a certain way to a certain point, and if you do all that well enough, then there's a pot of gold at the end of the rainbow and you can take 20 years off and go to the beach or whatever. And if you work backwards from that, that's where we get these crazy ideas of, from age 4 onwards, we need to be training our kids to get into the best middle school, to get into the best high school, to get into the best college, to get into the best job, to do that job for 35 years. So you can do nothing, which is so different from let's figure out who we are and why we matter and what's unique about us and how we can serve others through those gifts and so on. So that's my working theory. a lot of taking uncertainty out and not nearly enough learning how to deal with uncertainty, and in some ways accept it and embrace it and go on the journey.
That makes a lot of sense. Retirement is so antithetical to, I feel like, being alive. There's nothing else on the planet that says, right, I'm done. It's going to sit here. Everything else tries to outgrow itself every moment of every day. It's just such a funny thing that we created.
Yeah, very much.
Allison, can I ask just on the idea of fear? One of the things that we see quite often is when it's an area that you've no experience. So a CEO who's in their first business, they're fearful of everything. But then by the 10th business, they're fearful of nothing because they just have all the scarring and for whatever reason it disappears, and they see how hollow it is my working theory on it. But how does that interplay in what we're talking about here? Like the perception of fear in the scenarios that you're talking about seems to be almost the fear of the unknown. But when it comes to the evolution from a child to adulthood, like how does that play into there? Do you have any sense?
How the fear of the unknown becomes something that or how the unknown becomes something that we're fearful of.
Yeah, or where along the way do we pick up the fear gene and let go of, it's fine, and it's, as a kid it is all hollow because there is no abstraction, whereas and we genuinely are seeing this consistently, where there are folks that have an inner knowing, but conceptually if you were to ask an entrepreneur about many of these things, they just don't have a fear, so they don't even use the terminology, they don't even speak to it. But then you talk to someone who's an investor and they're massively fearful of 100 different things because they've never had that muscle memory of being kicked in the face in the arena.
It's very true. It's a really good point. And an excellent question. I'm going to come back to school a bit here because I do feel like that plays an important role. Because when you don't know something in school, you're punished. It's not allowed. You're given an exam, and if you don't know the answer, somebody's probably going to yell at you at some point. And being yelled at is a very unpleasant experience. And disappointing people is also something that we then become conditioned to not want to do. So we want people's approval for things. And so there's this sort of fear of failure, really, around not knowing things that might lead to people not approving of us or being disappointed in us. I certainly experienced that when I was a kid, that I was terrified all the time of my parents. And so I excelled at school purely out of fear. It was entirely motivated by that. And I see that in our students as well. We give them an assessment before and after the classes that we do. And there's no right answer. It's just how do you feel? And the older kids, they get really hung up on, well, which one's the right answer? There is no right answer. The right answer is what's true for you, but it's not, don't lie, but outside of that, it doesn't matter. And we ask a lot of open-ended self-reflection questions. The last class we just ran for 7th through 9th grade, so the kids were, say, 13 to 15 years old. We asked about intuition. And I'll ask the question, what is intuition? And it's silence. And every time I have to go, there's no right answer. You can't be wrong here. It's okay. So I do feel there's a very strong conditioning that happens with school in not knowing things. And then our culture sort of similarly has this sort of mirrors that, or the school mirrors the culture in knowing the answer to things. So having the information is seen as valuable and makes you, one, seem perhaps more intelligent or more in the know of something, and not knowing about something We use ignorant almost like a slur in this country. So there's this idea that if you're ignorant of something, there's something wrong with you or you're lesser than. And that makes it hard for people to embrace, I think, being in a space of unknowingness. And yet you're absolutely right. I mean, you don't know anything when you're little, and it's amazing. And the truth is, I don't know anything at all. I don't know. I try to ride the wave as best I can, and when it knocks me over, get back up again,
I'm so curious about your journey from the experience of being motivated out of fear to an experience that I'm guessing you have today, which is motivation out of love. How did that happen?
I got really sick in college. So I went to university because I was going to be a neurosurgeon. And this was all really socially constructed because when I was really small, I told my mother I wanted to be a teacher. And she said, you can't be a teacher. She was a teacher. And she said, you have to pick a profession that's more meaningful, I think were her words. And so I was pretty much given doctor or lawyer as my choices. I chose doctor. And then I go to university and I'm pre-med. And my sophomore year, I'm so stressed constantly because I'm taking all these pre-med classes. There's so much pressure. I don't want to fail. And in my reality, anything less than an A is a failure. So I'm just a mess. And I start to develop these stomach pains that no doctor can figure out where they're coming from, but they're so bad. I sometimes can't go to class. I'm just lying in bed in excruciating pain. And so it dawns on me, something's not right here. This is not a way to live. I'm 20 years old. And so I had this very strong feeling that I should go to Spain. I had been there once before on a school trip and I loved it. So I saved up $600. It's like not that much to travel on. Thankfully, I didn't know that. So I think there's always been a bit of me that's kind of just, I'll just see how it goes. Well, I think I thought I could get a job because I didn't understand how anything worked. So I thought I could just rock up in Spain and just be employed somehow, which is not a thing. Someone tried to employ me as a bartender, but I don't really drink. And so I was not going to be a good bartender. So I show up in Spain and I've got my money and I ration it so that I can stay in a hostel, and I find out quickly I can't get a job. So then what am I going to do? I get a journal and I start writing, and I start evaluating, okay, what am I doing right now with my life? What's going on? Why am I this sick? Why am I this miserable? This isn't supposed to be how it is. I'm only 20. I've got the misery of like a 65-year-old. So I just spent the whole summer writing and drawing in my journal and tracing back where this idea that I should be a doctor came from, where all these fears came from, evaluating my childhood. And I saw very clearly that I was meant to work with young people and that I wanted to open up a school. I was like, this is what I'm going to do. And I came back to the States. And I was immediately told I couldn't do that that was a dumb idea. And the concession was for me to do research. So as much as I can say, like, I don't maybe have as much fear. I still lived in fear of this idea that I had known I was supposed to do since I was 3. Saw again when I was 20, kept seeing over and over again. But kept being afraid of because everybody kept telling me, you can't do that, you will fail. And I didn't want to be a failure. But that experience did loosen me up a lot. So that was when I was still a neuroscience major, but I started also studying Spanish literature. So I did a dual major. I started going to art classes at RISD, just spending a lot more time out and about in the world and coming back to myself. And really doing my best not to have the fear dominate. I think it's a lifetime of undoing, for me anyway.
There seems to be this sense, and I feel it is prominent in your work, this sense that there's, and in the work you do today with children, that there is this sense that there is some innate capacity that exists to be nurtured, and that fire can be put out, and that this journey you've been on, there seems to be something about trying to help as many people avoid that experience that you've been through.
Yes, it's seeable, it's knowable in young people, especially really young kids, I would say younger than 5, really that school age. You can just see what they are attracted to, where their curiosity is. And it's obvious that we have something in us that naturally we're drawn to, that naturally we can't help but do. I remember I worked with this girl once who, every time she would sit down, she would just start building something. She couldn't not build something. So innate to her being was this desire to build. Now, whether it's a business or a building or whatever, a sculpture, I don't know. And it almost doesn't matter. It's that quality of, this is what's in me and wants to be expressed, that needs to be nurtured in all of us. And for me, teaching was always it. So I would find ways to put it into whatever I was doing. So if you kind of look at the trajectory of all the things that I did, it was always there. It just, or guiding maybe is a better word for it. It was always there, but just kind of hidden in these, or put into these other frameworks. And I'm so curious about what the world looks like if we're able to express that, if every one of us can express that beautiful thing that we have within us that we can't help but do in a way that's not bound by a bunch of constraints of the things that we put on ourselves, but just let it limitlessly, boundlessly explode. What does that feel like? What does that look like? What are we capable of as humans? Is it so much more? My feeling is it's so much more than what we've experienced. Yeah, I want to know. So a lot of this nurturing is, I'm so curious what life is like when you're not afraid of everything and limited by a bunch of social constructs that try to box you in.
What have you found is most powerful through the work, the practice of your work, and touching that place, reaching that place within children, some of which actually might have lost touch with it themselves?
I would say it's going to be 2 things. It's attention and no judgment. The judgment is what starts to create those doubts. And so if you're attentive but silently judging, it doesn't really do the thing that allows it to come out. And if you're not judging but unable to really hear what's being said, it also doesn't really work. So both of those things they give permission for that thing to come forward. And a lot of this is just about giving permission. You're allowed to show up here. It's safe. And more than that, it'll be embraced, whatever you show up with. If we could do that for each other, could you even imagine to show up in a place where somebody's not going to judge you at all and attends to what it is that you have to share? So simple, so powerful.
Could you unpack, when you talk about attention, and this is obviously something where we get particularly excited when it comes to quality and paying attention, what are the characteristics of this attention that you bring to bear that is so conducive towards this unfolding that you witness in children that can happen?
May I explain it in two ways? The non-material way and the material way. Okay. It has a texture. I'm going to explain it in the non-material way first, because that's the way I understand it. There's a texture to attention. And the image that's coming to my mind now is one of sandpaper. You can get it in different grains. I think that's what it's called. It can be really coarse. It can be really, really fine. And there's a really wide range in between. Most of our attention as adults is quite coarse, meaning we miss a lot of the in-between things because our minds are elsewhere, usually. So our eyes are here. Maybe our bodies might even be pointed at the person if we're lucky. But our minds are rolling through lists of things or making associations to other things. And that coarse attention is fine for some things. It's not the kind of attention that brings out the beauty in someone and makes them feel safe. There's too many gaps in the attention. Too many places where you might be unseen or where judgment might find its way in because you're not fully present. The quality of the attention that we work with is that sort of very, very, very fine, almost totally tightly knit. So there's no gap. There's no thought. It's almost synced up with the other person so that you're almost magnetically following them entirely. And there's no space for anything but everything to flow over and through you and back out. It's all that can happen is this sort of circular. Someone shares, it flows through you. Maybe there's something to share out, maybe not. It's that. In a more material sense of it, which is a lot harder for me to try to explain, it's the quality of attention that where there's no thought, which isn't to say that ideas might not come in, but they're not associative, or there's not a running script in the background, and it's not somebody says, oh, I love building, and then you go, oh, I know somebody who loved building, right? That's that associative listening that turns the lens back on you and takes the attention away from the person. And it's the feeling of, staying in the material space. It's eye contact, body facing, no thought. It's the best I can try to explain it. Hopefully the sandpaper analogy works. It's hard for me to explain it in the material space because it isn't a material thing. In my experience, it's this sort of vibrational thing that you can feel. Does that make any sense to anybody?
Allison, could I ask a quick follow-up, because it makes so much sense for me.
Oh, good.
One piece that strikes me is there's an insight that you have as a child through this filter of fine attention to what's being brought to you that then becomes coarse over time. I have in my own life definitely noticed that the best judges of character are actually like 3 to 7-year-old kids. Like, they're amazing at telling the quality of adults and like how nice people are and genuine they are. It's just really struck me that the description, the non-material description, actually makes so much sense in how you're describing it, because they are picking up those fine elements, and that's what they're perceiving in the interaction with adults that have nothing to do with the social interactions of adults that, when they're sitting around dinner and it just slips through the cracks. So yeah, no, I just wanted to share that. Like, you've blow my mind there because I've wondered why that was the case for so long, for decades. Like, why is it 3 to 5 year olds or 3 to 7 year olds seem to be able to tell really amazing people in my life that they could spot it within 10 seconds. Sorry,
No, it's
detract, but
exactly
I think
right.
it is the way you've described it. It makes so much sense, and I think that the piece to me that really strikes a chord is also around like the they're almost willing to let go of it. Like children are just experiencing, and then they're weaving through that filter, and then it's like, they're a weighing machine. They're like, okay, is it there, is it not? And if it isn't, they'll just let it go and they'll move on to the next person. Whereas I think adults, it becomes more about what's acceptable. Is this person, maybe it's like socially, are they a certain way? Mimetically, should I be associated? All that other stuff is blurring towards coarseness. That maybe there's an inherent acceptance of slightly more imperfections. uh,
Yes.
but yeah, no,
Yes.
Can I maybe try to riff on that with this all has me wondering about I don't know if balance is the right word, but I'll use it between shaping a young child who has is calibrated on some things about life and not calibrated on others, versus just kind of letting them emerge. So a very practical one, I have young kids, so, don't jump on the bed, you'll get hurt is very common in our lives. And we travel a fair bit, so there's been lots of beds and there's been some stitches and, so it's, there's always this tug between, ultimately I want my kids to emerge and, to turn into who they are and enjoy the process. They do not always have wisdom in what they ought not do. So obviously there's some balance here between, let a child blossom, but you got to nudge them in some ways. So can you just talk maybe a little bit about how you think about that?
Yes. My first feeling on that is that our whole social structure on how we raise children is flawed in that it all comes back to two people if we're lucky, and a lot of times just one. And that doesn't work very well because parents, I feel like the role of parents is exactly what you're saying, John. You have to provide those guardrails and those boundaries because that's what parents are meant to do. And then other adults in the life of children can provide these sort of safer or like bounce house kind of experiences where, and not that parents can't also do that, but there has to be adults in a child's life, whether it's parents or otherwise, who are helping to set boundaries and helping them find where those boundaries are for themselves in a way that's really safe. And then there also have to be those adults where you can just let loose and be the grandparents, the aunties, the extended community. That we don't really have, kids just don't have exposure to that. They have parents, they have teachers, and they're all boundary setting for them. There's no space where it's just okay. Maybe they have a grandparent, if they're lucky, they see every so often, or an aunt every so often they might see. So that's the first thing I will say, is that to put all of this on parents is absurd, and you can't. I want to be really clear that this idea of all the time just unfolding, like to your point, it doesn't work in a house where there's two adults and multiple children. I feel like it's important to be realistic about that. And so for me as parents, the best that can be done in this situation then is an explanation whenever possible of the why behind things, so that you're not instilling a fear around something without a base. So it's more of oh, this is the why. And even when kids are really little and they don't seem to understand, as Paul was saying, they do pick up on things that they might not be able to articulate. So if you take the time to explain, right now, that's maybe not the best choice, and here's why I'm saying that, it gets them in the habit at least of reflecting on a situation as opposed to automatically responding to a situation. And that alone is powerful and meaningful whenever possible, with the full understanding that it's a full-time job having children, and it's not always possible to be in a space of complete attention and patience to go, oh, the reason why we're not jumping on the bed right now is for this. I also jumped on the bed in college and broke my foot, so I can say I can have the experience of, yes, it's possible to get hurt. And then it's also possible to go to the emergency room and be very severely judged for being hurt from jumping on your bed when you're an adult.
That's where you come up with the lie.
There is something important as much as possible about being in a space of truth with kids as an adult, as a parent. However you come at it in terms of boundary setting, that you're as much as possible in a space of truth and not in a space of fear around what's actually happening. And I say all this understanding again that this is far easier to do when there's many people around, and very, very difficult to do when it's one to a number of children and you're working and life feels like it's impinging on you and on and on. So there is no judgment here in what I'm saying. It's just a response to the question.
I would love to pick up on something we touched on a few moments ago about young kids being quite often excellent judges of character, and what that might tell us about the capacity of a young child, to the quality of their attention. What in your experience is going on there? There's fine-grained attention, there's this non-cognitive element, it's very somatic, kids are feeling. But what do you see in the way a healthy young kid is wired that puts them in that position to be so effective in the way they assess character?
There's a lack of labels. There's a lack of knowing of labels. So there's not an attempt to categorize things, which we tend to do as adults almost immediately. Where does this person fit into what category? And there isn't a wanting, which I think is a really important thing. That we as adults are constantly subtly and not so subtly manipulating each other because we want things. We think we want things. And I know that people say children are really good manipulators and they get what they want. And that is true when it's things that they really are starting to desire or want. But for the most part, if you just put them in front of a stranger, they don't want anything from that person. They're not trying to get something. So they don't have a need to try to work out a story that would allow this person to be a certain way to get the thing that they want from them. It's like a whole thing that we do in the back of our heads that I don't think we're aware of. They don't do that. They don't have any requirements. And then really young kids, aside from the basic necessities of food and shelter and water and sleep and things like that, and nurturing and love, they're very whole. And they use the word whole as humans. So they can approach things as a whole human with no need for, as Paul said, no need for judgment. It either works or it doesn't work. If it doesn't work, we just move on. It doesn't matter. And getting to that place as an adult, again, once that's lost, is really, really difficult. But I feel like that really contributes so much to the sensitivity of their attention and their intuition. And the fact that so many children have it says that it's in all of us. So I feel like that's important to say, that it's not like it's gone. We just paint over it, a million coats of paint, and then bury it. But we could let it out. We all have the ability to perceive in that way. Yeah, I think for me, it's those two things. the categorization of things really limits us.
With this idea of wanting as well, it seems to be stemmed from kind of our version of ourselves, the ego, whatever word we want to put on it. And some of the actual guests that we've had in the past, we've talked about this idea of like the dissolution of your ego. It can be a positive thing, right? Like you go through one version of your career, it all gets destroyed, and then you have to rebuild. And that actually that integration process is a process where you're rebuilding something, and actually that can be a very positive thing over time. When you work with adults and in a corporate setting, how does ego play into that dynamic? And of the systems that you've worked with that are malleable, what did they have that others didn't? Or yeah, be interested to just understand this idea in the context of your work.
The ego, we'll use that term, the ego. It's so funny. It's so in the way. It's like if you can penetrate or get around it, it's sort of in my head shows up this big, almost like, have you seen Big Hero 6? It's a very specific reference. It's this, it looks like that. It's kind of this really big, almost clumsy, squishy thing that shows up and it just plops itself down. It's like, I'm here. And then you have to sort of subtly try to get around it, but it really gets in the way. It's just so in the way of so many companies. Everything is about trying to be seen and satisfy this sort of need, this need to be seen and need to be seen in a very specific way, as if we could control how other people perceive us, and as if it mattered at all. But it really does to people. And then the companies where that isn't as present, there's a lot more imagination and creativity that flows. So the spaces where there's this big thing blocking the door, nothing gets in or out. Another way of thinking about it is if you imagine closing your fist, holding on tightly to something, nothing gets in or out because it's closed. But if you can let go, letting go is really just about opening so that things can come and go as they please. And that includes space for imagination, space for something new and creative. And the real shame, I feel like, what I see in corporate America is just this recapitulation, probably the same in other places in Europe as well, this sort of recapitulation of the same set of ideas over and over and over again. It's a copy of a copy of a copy of a copy. It's just like not interesting. And it's like a copy that's changed the color over here and a copy that's the line's a little bit different over there, but it's still the same thing. And when you can let that ego move aside even just a little bit, it allows for these ideas to come in that are new, they're different, they're more imaginative, and they're invigorating to a culture, as of course they would be, because a copy of a copy of a copy is not interesting at all. And if we take that back to kids, kids are constantly innovating on things. The kids in our class are not reproducing things. They're making new things all the time. Because why would they reproduce something that already exists? And that's what they say to us, especially the young ones. Why would I make something I've seen on television? I want to make something new. I want to make something I've never made before. Yeah, the ego tends to get in the way of that.
The idea, definitely for the folks that I know in a creative context, their care goes into the self-expression, and it's removed from every other element. Whereas I think the people who might be copying or mimetically going a different direction, I think they tend to point care across lots of different parts to the version of self-expression, whether that's who's coming, the audience, or like none of that matters to somebody who's like constrained and focused on the one thing, which is I care very deeply about this one thing. The one other question I have is something that has just struck me as we think about this idea within the context of even positive movements, where company has this negative capitalist connotation. It's all profit making and all that. There are some organizations that actually have very positive. You've been involved in some of them, like a very positive idea of where they want the world to go. They also fulfill to this. What are the differences between the organizations and the teams and that you've seen almost forget about abstractions and actually only focus on like positive activity and like hopefully that makes sense. But what I'm trying to get to is like a lot of the experience, and I've spent a lot of time with systems thinkers and people who have like spent a lot of time in ecology and like very non-profit organizations and like spent decades trying to solve this. And their constant feedback is it failed because we focused on amplifying the problem instead of we failed on actually putting all that energy as an activation, basically like focus on the activity itself. And actually, we should have just focused on waste instead of ESG initiatives and these fancy presentations. We should have just focused on my fridge, right? It felt to me that it would be an interesting thread to just pull on for a little bit in terms of like that idea of what do those ones that you have seen succeed do better in terms of those who actually have walked the walk.
It's a really interesting question. I haven't seen many. There are a few. There is I mean, to your point, the focus on I'm going to say positive, but not in a good or bad message way, but sort of the focus on positive messaging around what's being done that's beneficial for people makes a huge difference. A huge difference. People prefer to be around that energy. In the space where I was before in sustainability, one of the reasons I think we were so successful was that everything was about joining a community that was doing something different in a positive, beneficial way. And we never talked. I mean, now the organization, I think, does, but at the time, I never talked about the carbon emissions of things or how terrible it all was, because I don't know, it's a lot. It's a lot to burden somebody with all of that. So when I think about companies like Patagonia, for example, in that sustainability space, the people I know who work for that company are so invigorated by the messaging that's all around. Look at what we're able to contribute, and it's true. It's not lies, because there's another thing around that too, where companies are like, look how great we are, and they're, I don't know that they even know that they're not telling the truth, you know. So there's a little bit there of like, but my feeling is that when the heart of the company is aligned outward, so as you were speaking, that was the thing that kept showing up, is when the heart is out, it's about for the truly with the intention of to support humanity. It's a very different feeling than when the words say that, but the heart of the company is in, and the goal is quite clearly to enrich the people who are part of it. So to enrich the world versus to enrich yourself, and it feels very different. And that's something that I feel is very easy to spot within 30 seconds of talking to somebody where the company's heart is oriented towards. Where I feel nonprofits in particular have a difficult time is when their heart is, when they forget really that they are part of the world. So when your heart is oriented outwards towards the world and you forget that you're part of it, then you tend to give more than you possibly can to sustain something. So the first thing we talk to adults about in that space is an understanding of no separation. And if you can really feel that idea that we are all the same. I'm you, you're me. then doing something that hurts me hurts you. So why would I do that? Right? Creating an organization that's not self-sustaining doesn't actually benefit people. It doesn't benefit me. It doesn't benefit, in the end, doesn't benefit you. So there has to be this baseline understanding of giving an outward focus that includes you as part of that and nurtures, therefore, truly all people involved. I just noticed so many nonprofits come from the space of depletion of themselves. And I have to say, I mean, I still fall to that too. It's hardly like I've worked out everything in life. And it's easy to fall to that because you want to go help, you want to go give, and then you realize, oh wait, there's nothing there. Hold on.
Maybe I can pick up on this idea of one of the questions we like to ask and offer to all of our guests is, what help are you looking for? And then I might tie that together with, as part of that, if you could let, listeners know where and how they could connect with you. So first, what kind of help are you looking for? And then if, for those who want to connect to help or otherwise, how could they do so?
Thank you for asking that. I would say if anybody feels like that this idea sparks something in them, that this conversation sparks something in them, I would just love to have a conversation, to hear other perspectives. I feel other perspectives are so valuable in this space. There's not a lot of people doing this kind of work with kids, and I really value what people have to say and their experience in this space. More tangibly, I would say we're building towards creating a retreat center for kids. So the work is being done right now in a kind of after school, in the summer, kind of ad hoc sort of way with multiple organizations. And while it's very effective, it's not as effective as it would be if we were able to actually provide a space for kids to come for a week or two. So I would say if somebody's listening and hears that idea and thinks, oh, I have ideas around that, how that might be, or I want to contribute in some way, please reach out. That would be amazing. And yeah, if you're moved to contribute in some other way, please do. For me, this is a movement. It's an idea. There's an organization behind it because it needs a structure because of the system that we live in, but it's really about moving and sharing this idea. So if you feel so moved, please share the idea with people. The more we can get this out there, I feel the greater chance we have for shifting what the experience of childhood is like, and also the experience of adulthood for all of us. We have a website. It's the URL is epicenter.org, and there are dashes in between the words. So it's epicenter.org. Check us out. And yeah, thank you. Thanks for asking. And please, if you feel like being involved, please be involved. It's meant to be a global community of people, and I'd love to hear from people who are excited by this idea.
We'll put those details in the show notes as well. Our closing question for the Art of Quality podcast is always the same, which is, what is your most memorable experience with quality? That could be an experience, a service, an item, really anything. I'm curious what your most memorable experience is with quality.
To date, the most memorable experience was I was at a conference, a learning and memory conference, when I was running the nonprofit, and we had a booth. And I wanted to leave because it just wasn't a good fit. And something compelled me to stay a bit longer. And up the stairs walks this person who was the first time I felt an adult who felt completely different. Don't know how else to explain it other than that. He was the most whole adult I'd ever experienced. And when we spoke, the quality of his attention caught something in me from back when I was really small. And it was transformative. It's maybe the word's overused, but that's really the only way I can describe it. He had this way of being that I'd never experienced before. And so when I think about quality as a texture, the texture of this person is so different that it jolted me into a different space. I don't know to what extent we are able to accomplish that for the kids we work with. It's my hope that someday that's the feeling that people have when they're working with us, that it feels so different that it clicks something into space.
That's beautifully put.
Could I, very briefly, in the second before we wrap up, what adjectives come along with that experience? What words would you use to describe the quality of this attention you experienced?
Pure. Casting, meaning like sort of an outward, this motion, casting. I don't know how else to describe that. Like fairy dust, so it has this sort of almost magical feeling to it. Arresting in that it pulls you. Consuming. I lost all sense of what was happening in the space. I think we talked for 3 hours, but I also don't know. And empowering, another word I know that's overused, and yet there's a reason that word exists, because it's generated something in me that was new, or not new, but it hadn't been felt for a long time.
Empowering. Wonderful.
Thank you for listening. And for more resources, please visit our website, theartofquality.co. If you think of anyone that could be a good fit for this format, please reach out via the website.